Hello there, everybody. Today we're going to finish up talking about Chapter 19. So remember, Chapter 19 is our first foray into the world of macroeconomic topics, and we're beginning with a study of GDP, Gross Domestic Product, which is our #1 way of measuring kind of growth and living standards in a country. Gross Domestic Product, don't forget, is the final value of goods and services produced in a country in a year. And even though we report it as numbers, it's actually the idea behind gross domestic product is the product or production, how much stuff that we produce. However, we do use the the market value of all final goods when we report the GDP, because a list of everything that the country made is too long. All right, and so we use the market value, and also remember it's final goods and services. We don't count intermediate goods because that would lead to double counting. All right, today we're going to look at some other concerns when we're talking about how do we measure it and the utility or the usefulness of gross domestic product. So let me share my slides with you. Okay, so first thing that we want to think about is that the production has to be from a particular period. This avoids issues also with double counting. So for example, let's say that a new car is produced and sold in 2014. 2 years later, the owner decides to sell it. Now think about that. Would that go into GDP? Well, no, actually, it should not go into GDP. The reason why it should not go into GDP is because even though the car was sold and we use the market value of a final good, this is a final good, it was already sold in the year that it was made, and that counts for the production. Remember what we're trying to do, we're trying to add up the production or the amount of stuff that we make in the country in a given year. That's the whole idea behind GDP. We use the number of the value when it was sold just because a list of all the stuff we made is too long. So if this is a used car sold 2 years later, it doesn't count in the GDP because it's not something that was made that year in the GDP, okay? All right, so when we think about how we put this together, first of all, the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, is the US government agency that tallies the GDP data, and they call it national income accounting. Oh, one other thing that's really interesting about GDP, don't forget that GDP is simultaneously equal to the expenditures, but it's also equal to everybody's income. If you added up everybody's income in the entire United States, the number that you would get would be GDP. It would also be the amount of money that everybody spent. Because remember, on the economy level, every dollar that's spent as expenditure, somebody else sees it as income. So income equals expenditure at a national level. All right, so that is why we can call it national income accounting, but actually all of these categories you're about to see are all expenses or stuff that people spend money on. So here's the way we write it down. So Y stands for GDP, okay, or the output. So Y is the GDP. We often call it output because remember, GDP is just the amount of stuff that we make. All right, C, so we add up how much money people spent on consumption in the United States in a year. So every single thing that you bought on a new good, that's consumption. So we add that up. I is investment. So investment, don't forget, the specialized term that we use in this class for investment means the purchase of physical capital. So anytime a firm purchases computers, machines, a factory, a tractor, anything like that, it goes into investment, and it goes into this category, and we add it up. Now G, we have government purchases, all right? This is not government spending, this is government purchases. This is really important. We're not talking about money given to individuals who get like Social Security payments or welfare payments. We mean when the government goes out and buys a road, purchases the funds for a road, pays for actual goods or services, okay? Buys an airplane, something like that. All right, so when the government spends money, it's G, and then we have net exports. Net exports we'll get into in a little bit, but basically it's the amount of exports that we buy minus the imports. Okay, or excuse me, the exports we sell minus the imports we buy. So it's exports minus imports. And so that's how we add up. So we add up everybody's income. We actually add up what everybody spent in the entire country. If you look at that, that's just the entire expenditures. Every single thing that's spent in the country to buy a thing or a product will fall into one of these 4 categories. And so if we look at the categories, again, we can see kind of the relative size. So this is from 2015 when our GDP was about $18 trillion. You see that down there. And you see of that 18 trillion, about 12 trillion was consumption. And so if we break that out into durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, you see this is about 70% of our GDP, and the lion's share was bought in services. So the amount of services that we produced, which is the same as what people bought, and that's the amount that it shows up in the GDP, is about 8.2 trillion. All right, investment, don't forget this is the companies purchasing physical capital, is about 3 trillion or 16.8%. Government purchases is about 3.1 trillion or about, close to 20%. And then net exports, don't forget it's exports minus imports. So we sold about $2.2 trillion worth of stuff, but we purchased $2.7 trillion worth of stuff. So we have negative $500 billion there. In net exports. All right, so you add that up, and that is our GDP. Okay, so consumption, the group that we know as consumption, we call this C in the National Income Identity Accounting. National Income Accounting Identity, right? And that is, don't forget, Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay, now we're talking about the C for consumption. So we broke it out into durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Durable goods, what's a durable good? Consume over a long period. A refrigerator, that's a durable good. Non-durable good, consumed over a short period. Oranges, that Instacart brings you because you can't go outside right now. Those are non-durable goods. And then services are things like haircuts, financial advice, anything that doesn't have to do with an actual good. Okay, so investment, don't forget investment. This is an important definition, capital purchases by firms. There's one other thing that goes into investment, changes in business inventories. So, okay, remember that car that we talked about that was made in 2014 and sold in 2014? What if the car was made in 2014 but wasn't sold until 2015? Which year's GDP does it go in? Hopefully you say 2014, because remember, GDP is the measurement of everything that we made, products made in 2014. So we actually can't use the sale price, which happened in 2015, in the 2014 GDP calculation because it's not there yet. So what happens is we say that the company is kind of saving it. And that's what we mean by inventories, all right? So let's say General Motors, they didn't sell the car. It goes into their inventory. Basically, it makes their company more valuable. Like they have a car that they made, but they haven't sold yet. So the company's worth more because if you add up everything that the company owns, now it's worth more. So when we have a change in our business inventory, in other words, there's just more stuff that's been made but hasn't been sold yet, we put those in the investment category because it's got to go somewhere, right? Everything that's made in 2014, we have to put the sale price at it either in C or I or G or NX somewhere, and they just choose that it goes in I. Another important thing that goes into I is in new residential housing. Notice this is new, okay? It has to be new housing. If a house is built and then it's sold many years later, it's a used house, just like the used car. It doesn't go into the GDP, but a new house is something that we made in the country in that given year, and it goes into investment. Side note, let's say you pay rent for a house. That's actually a service that you're buying. It's called housing. This does not go into investment. That actually goes into consumption, all right? So the amount of money that you spend on your rent actually goes into consumption under the services column. But for the actual construction cost of that house, that goes into investment and only in the year in which it was created. Okay, another thing I want to say, and I've told you this before, and let's not forget, investment does not mean the purchase of stocks and bonds. I know everybody uses that term, investment, for stocks and bonds, but that's not what we're talking about. If you think about it, if I'm buying stocks or bonds from the stock market, am I purchasing an actual product? No, that doesn't go into GDP at all. The purchase of stocks and bonds does not go into GDP whatsoever because I'm not buying a thing. I'm not buying a product. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if I buy some shares of Apple and Apple gets more money because of me and Apple turns around and they invest in a bigger factory, well, that does go into GDP, the investment that Apple made, but not my purchase into it. Okay. All right. So hopefully we've clarified investment. It's probably the trickiest category of all of them to deal with. And after investment comes government purchases. So government purchases include spending by state, local, and federal government on goods and services. For example, the expenditures on United States Postal Service, those are things that we buy, the government buys. Important to note that transfer payments are not included. So remember I said transfer payments like Social Security payments to elderly people or welfare payments to people who are down on their luck. These kind of dollars do not go in government purchases. And you know why not? Well, if you answered because they're not purchases of stuff, product, then that is correct. And if you think about it though, let's say that an elderly person gets a $1,200 a month Social Security payment. They're going to turn around and take that $1,200 and buy stuff. The stuff that they buy, then that actually goes into the GDP. So we don't want to count it when they get income paid to them. That's not actually a government is a purchase. That's just a government expenditure. All right. So we only look at the stuff that the government actually buys to go into the category called G. And finally, there are net exports. And we calculate that this is X minus I. Okay, exports minus imports. So and don't forget, exports are when it's something that's produced here and that's sold abroad, and import is when it's produced over there in another country and it's sold here and we buy it here. Okay, so if your imports are greater than your exports, that means you take in more stuff to your country than you sell out. Then your net exports is less than zero, and you have what's called a trade deficit. Now, don't forget, United States number for this is negative $512 billion as of 2015. So what do we have? Yes, that's right, a trade deficit. Not all countries have a trade deficit. For example, China, their exports are much greater than their imports. They have what's called a trade surplus. Okay, so it's something to kind of think about. But for purposes of thinking about the GDP, the reason why we have to subtract off the imports is because of the following reason. GDP only measures the stuff we make here. If I buy a bottle of French wine from France, did we make it here? No. But guess what? I paid money for it. So it's going to show up in the consumption column as a bottle of, I paid $20 for this bottle of Bordeaux from France. That's going to show up in the C part of the Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, right? It's going to show up in the C. But I don't want it to show up in the GDP and the Y, so I have to subtract it off in the imports over here. So if you think about it, if I have Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, and I buy a $20 bottle of wine, it goes in there, but then I have to subtract it off here, so it's going to be a negative 20. These two things will cancel, and so the net change to our GDP ought to be zero, because we can't have it show up in the GDP because it wasn't something that was made in the United States. All right, so net exports represents a small fraction of total GDP. I think that you saw that it's around like 3% of our total GDP. Question, is it bad to be in a trade deficit? Well, the United States is in a big old trade deficit, $512 billion. We make 512, we buy or take from the world $512 billion more each year than we contribute to the world, right? At the end of the day, if your neighbor borrowed from you more than they loaned, borrowed more stuff from you than they gave to you, then your neighbor's not going to be happy with you at the end of the day. So, some people might think that it's bad to be in a trade deficit, and sometimes it might be. I would say not necessarily. If you import more goods and services for people in the country, people might be happier. So since our GDP is a measurement of happiness, kind of our standard of living, maybe we do have a higher standard of living when we import more. It might not be sustainable long term. Eventually other countries are going to somehow say, hey, you're taking more from us than you're giving to us, United States. We're going to do something, make some price changes, right? Charge you, stop loaning you money, something like that. Okay, let's continue on. So remember earlier I talked about real GDP. Now real GDP, we have to adjust the GDP for price changes. And what I'm talking about here is this guy. What am I writing? Inflation. I mean changes in price over time. We all know the stuff gets more expensive over time. That might make the GDP look like it's going up. And in fact, the nominal GDP does go up because the nominal GDP is if I just do the GDP and I measure in the then current prices. So I make the 2010 GDP using the prices of the goods in 2010 and the 2015 GDP in the prices from 2015. But the problem is from 2010 to 2015, all the prices are getting more expensive. So it makes the nominal GDP look like it goes up. So I can fix that. I use this technique called real GDP. And I just pick a year. It doesn't matter which year, but I just pick a year and I hold that year and I just use those prices for every other year. So I pick, I don't know, 2010 to be my base year, okay? And then I can calculate the prices, the GDP using 2010 prices, okay? All right, and so coming on, this is a slightly different idea, but I wanted to introduce this idea of that we have this thing called a price level. What is a price level? A price level is an index used to measure prices of goods and services in an economy. Now, this is incredibly important. Listen up. A price index is not a measurement of the GDP at all. A price index doesn't measure how much stuff you made. That's what the GDP is for. A price index measures how much the prices of those goods that we count in the GDP changed, all right? So you might be like, oh, of course. GDP measures the amount of stuff we made. The price index measures the change in the price of those things. They're completely different, right? You might have the price index go up a bunch, but GDP not grow at all. And so your economy's not getting better. Everything's getting more expensive, right? Okay, now, as long as you have that clear, because I'm about to tell you something a little bit confusing, one of the main price indices that we use is called the GDP deflator. Don't get confused. This has nothing to do with measuring the GDP, all right? Yeah, I know. Why do you think they call it the GDP deflator? Well, probably the number one reason is because it's the price level index that includes prices of all of the goods that were included in the GDP. So we call it the GDP deflator. It does not measure GDP. It measures the price of all the stuff that is included in the GDP, but we're just measuring the price changes here, okay? So that's the GDP deflator. The other one that's very common to use is the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. We'll talk more about these in our chapter on inflation, but I want to introduce these two ideas to you, okay? That we have a GDP, that's really the topic of our this chapter, but then we also need to somehow keep track of prices because nominal GDP will go up if both prices and we make more stuff, right? If prices go up and we make more stuff, real GDP will only go up when we make more stuff, so it goes up more slowly, okay? All right, let's look at a graph, an actual graph, not one that I just drew with my hand. Okay, so let's look here. Here's our nominal GDP, starting in 2009. Here's our real GDP. Why is nominal GDP going up more quickly? See how there's space from here to here? Well, the difference between these two is inflation, the change in price. You see nominal GDP is going up because we add all of the stuff made, but all the stuff that's being made, yeah, we're making more of it. That's what real GDP is telling me. But when I make more of it and it's just getting more expensive because of inflation, then that makes the nominal GDP go up even more, right? So we're about to touch 18 trillion here in 2015. Our real GDP is around 16 trillion. No, it's a little bit more than 16 trillion. Okay, now I want to point out something. Notice that they're the same in 2009. That's because 2009 is the base year. In other words, when I'm calculating my real GDP here, what I do is every year I look at the nominal GDP and how much stuff is made, but then I use the prices from 2009, and that's how I keep this lower because it's just using the prices of whatever the goods cost in 2009. So in 2009, clearly, they're gonna be the same. And this is the key to remember. In the base year, the nominal and real GDP are always going to be the same. Remember I told you before that you could choose any year's prices. It doesn't matter as long as you keep them the same. That is true. Let's imagine that we had chosen 2011 for the base year. If we had chosen 2011 for the base year, then the nominal and real GDP would have been the same, and the nominal GDP would have come up like this, right? And then it would have come down like this. That would have been the nominal GDP if we had chosen 2011 as the base year, okay? So this is confusing because it makes the number of the real GDP change depending upon which year you use as the base year. You're like, well, if I use 2009 prices, my GDP might be, I don't know, 16 trillion. If we use 2011 prices, it's gonna be even a little bit higher, you know, maybe it's 17 trillion. Yeah, that's why what's really more important to look at is not necessarily the change in, the actual number of GDP, but the change in the GDP, all right? So we often talk about the change in the GDP. Or another thing we talk about is the distance between nominal and real GDP, which, don't forget, is just related to this thing called inflation, right? That's what makes nominal GDP go up faster. Okay, now let me show you another chart here. I have nominal GDP in each year. So look at this. In 2016, we made almost $14 trillion worth of stuff measured in 2006 prices. In 2007, we made about $14.5 trillion worth of stuff in 2007 prices. In 2008, we made 14.7 trillion in 2008 prices. Now, if I come over and I ask, well, I'm not maybe interested in nominal GDP, I'm interested in the real GDP. I want to know how much the price level changed. That's what this column's for. Now, we use the GDP deflator. Don't forget, the GDP deflator is a change in prices. It has nothing to do with how much stuff we made. It's the change in the prices of the stuff that's included in the GDP. That's why the word GDP is in there. But it's a change in prices. So let's look at first here. First of all, note that in 2009, the price level is 100. What must that mean? That must mean that we're thinking of 2009 as the base year, okay? The prices are 100% of what they are in the base year. Now, the next year, I see 101. That means that in 2010, the prices were 101%, or 1% more than they were in 2009. If I look in 2013, you see the GDP deflator is 107. In other words, if I look in 2013, the prices were 107% of what they were in 2009. So the difference between 100 and 107% is 7%. That means that prices went up from 2009 to 2013. Prices went up 7% during all of that time, okay? And so I can, if I want to know, hey, I'm not interested in the GDP in 2013 dollars because the prices went up. I'd like to suck out those old prices. I can actually use the GDP deflator to put everything into 2009 prices, okay, convert it to the base year, and then I can just compare how much the GDP really changed, like how much really more stuff did we make, because that's what I'm actually interested in. Let me show you how to do that. So first, if I want to go from nominal to real GDP, I remove the current prices from the nominal GDP data. Remember, I can suck out the prices that change, the ones that went up too high. How do I do that? I take the nominal GDP by the contemporaneous price level, so the price level in that year. So let me go back a slide real quick. Remember I said in 2013, I'm not interested in the nominal GDP. I want to know the real GDP. I take this and I divide it by this GDP deflator, because this tells me how much more the prices changed over the base year. Okay, so I divide nominal GDP by the contemporaneous price level, or the price level of that year, and then I put back in the prices of the base year, which is nice. It's always 100, right? The GDP deflator for the base year is always 100, and I follow this formula, right? So I take nominal GDP in time t, that's what time t is. And then I divide it by the price level in time t. And the price level we're using is the GDP deflator. Remember, what's the name of the other price level that we could use? That's right, the consumer price index. We're not going to use that in this chapter, not till our chapter on inflation. But I want you to be aware you can use either the GDP deflator or the CPI in this place here, we're going to use just the GDP deflator. Okay, so I take nominal GDP, how much stuff we made in current prices, divided by the prices of that year. Notice it's the same year. And so basically I sucked out the year of prices then, and I multiply by 100. Why do I multiply by 100? Because that is the GDP deflator in the base year, is 100. And I'm going to go back a slide again, sorry. I know this makes it difficult, but notice that the GDP deflator in the base year is always 100, okay? All right, so then I get the real GDP for that year. Okay, let's do an actual example. So I'm going to go back to that table and I'm going to find the real GDP for 2014. So if you want to pause this for a second, rewind a little bit, and you plug in the numbers using T equals 2014, using that formula. I'll let you do it. All right. So if you flipped over, rewound this a little bit, you would see that 17.3 trillion is in 2014, and the contemporaneous price level, the price level is 109. That means that the prices of everything on average were 109% what they were in the base year. They had increased 9% from the base year. So I divide by 109, I times it by 100. Another way to think of this is I took out 2014 prices and I put back in 2009 prices, and I got $15.9157 trillion. Okay, so that is another way to think about it. That is the 2014 real GDP in 2009 prices, right? Because 2009 is the base year. So I sucked out the 2014 prices, I put in the 2009 prices, and I was able to calculate the real GDP. Now, it's worth saying again, I already said this one time, so bear with me, but depending upon what year you use as the base year, it's gonna make your real GDP be completely different, right? Right, because the prices were different in each year. But that's okay, because what we're really interested in the real GDP is not the actual number that's the real GDP. We're interested in whether it's growing or whether it's going down. Okay, we're interested in the percentage change. Okay, and so that basically is called a growth rate, right? We're calculating a growth rate. What we're really interested in with the real GDP is not the number, 15 trillion, 16 trillion, 17 trillion. How did it grow? So how do you calculate the growth rate? Well, we use the percent change formula. Don't kill me here. We use a percent change formula, the real percent change formula, not the midpoint formula. Remember back when we were learning about elasticity, I said when you calculate percentage change of prices and quantities for elasticity, use the midpoint method. Yeah, that's great. Do that for elasticity. Always use the midpoint method. Use the regular, not midpoint, the regular percent change formula that you learned in math when we calculate growth rates for GDP. Remember, what I'm really more interested in real GDP is the growth rate. So I take my new value minus my old value divided by my old value and then times 100 to turn it into a percent. So the reason why I do times 100 here is it's because to turn it into a percent. All right, this 100 makes it be a percent. Okay, so I do new minus old over old. That is the percent change formula you learned in math class, okay? And so let's do an example. Let's say that I'm interested in nominal GDP growth in 2012. Okay, somebody asked me, what's our nominal GDP growth? That means I want to know what the percent change, don't forget this uppercase Greek letter delta means change. I want to know the percent change in the nominal GDP from 2011 to 2012. That's what I mean. And I don't, honestly, most of the time when they say, what's the growth rate of GDP in 2012? They mean from 2011 to 2012, but they'll never say 2011. They just assume that you know it's from the last one to the current one. So you're gonna go find the data. You're gonna have to use nominal GDPs here, just because this is what the question's asking for. Maybe they ask for real GDPs, then you would use the real GDPs. But if it asks for nominal GDP growth in 2012, you do the nominal GDP in 2012 minus the nominal GDP in 2011 divided by the nominal GDP in 2011 times 100. Okay, so go grab those numbers and pause it, grab the numbers from the chart, come back, and I'll meet you on the next slide. All right, so here's the numbers from that table. Hopefully you rewound it and grab them. So I did 16.155 trillion minus 15.518 trillion. That's the nominal GDP in 2012 minus the nominal GDP in 2011. divided by the nominal GDP in 2011 times 100, I got 4.1%. Okay, so the GDP grew from 2011 to 2012 by 4.1%. But hopefully you have alarm bells going off in your head, because you should know that when I say it grew 4.1%, that's the nominal GDP. That means that both when I increased the amount of stuff we made plus when the prices changed, that together it made 4.1%. That's not really probably what I'm interested in, okay? What we're really interested in is how much more stuff did we make, right? So what you should do is you should convert the nominal GDPs into real GDPs using the base year. Remember, you could use any base year. It actually doesn't matter. You'll get the same growth rate no matter what base year you use. But you want to change to real GDP, use the base year, and then do this same formula using the real GDP. And the number you get, I'll let you do this on your own because it's not too difficult, but it's a good practice. The number you'll get will be less than 4.1% because during that same year, the prices were changing also, okay? And if I want to measure how much the prices changed, I can actually ask for the GDP deflator growth rate. Or I could also, don't forget, the other price index that I could use is the CPI, right? CPI and GDP deflator are the two. I can find the growth rate. So let's say that I'm interested in looking at the price level growth rate or percent change in the price level. Let's say I want to do this for the year 2013, okay? So if I'm asking how much did the price level grow in 2013, meaning how much was inflation in 2013, how much did the prices on average go up, what am I doing here? Well, what years am I talking about? See, here's another tricky one. They never say what year they're talking about starting it. It's just the year before. So when I say how much did prices change, or what was the inflation, what was the change in the price level in 2013, I mean from 2012 to 2013, all right? So go back to the table, grab that. Go grab the numbers from the GDP deflator in 2012 and 2013, and I'll meet you on the next slide. Okay, so here's the numbers hopefully that you got. The price level was 107 in 2013, and then it was 105 in 2012. And so I go new minus old over old, and I get 1.9%. In other words, the price level went up 1.9%, or on average, the inflation rate between 2012 and 2013 was 1.9%. Okay. Note that this 107 means as compared to the base year, which was 2009, the prices went up 7%. This is from 29 to 2012, it went up 105%, right? But the question I'm asking is not from the base year to 2013 and the base year to 2012. I'm asking what was the change from 2012 to 2013, and that was 1.9%. Okay, you can't just go, oh, I know, from 5 to 7, that's 2, because you see it's a little bit different. Okay, another useful formula that might be interested in is the following. If you do the percentage change formula with nominal GDP, okay, that's going to equal to the percentage change formula that you did with the real GDP, plus if you did the percentage change level in the price level using the same years, okay? So remember a couple slides ago we had, well, actually let me check what it was. 4.1%. Remember we saw that from 2011 to 2012, this went up 4.1%, okay? Remember I said that was composed of both changes in actual stuff, real GDP, plus changes in the price level. So if you could find out, if you went back and found the change in the price level or the inflation rate from 2011 to 2012, that's the change in the GDP deflator, and you put this in here, and then you would know the percent change in the real GDP too, because you could just subtract it from 4.1%. Okay, so the change in the nominal GDP changes because of both changes in stuff, the real GDP, plus the changes in the price level. When we're talking about how much the economy grows, make sure people are using the real GDP. If people are using the nominal GDP, that's not really what we're after, because that's also incorporating the changes in price. Okay, let's see here. What are some shortcomings of GDP? Well, GDP, remember, is a measure of production, and we use it as a proxy for well-being. But there are several shortcomings of this measure, including non-market goods, stuff that's not sold on the market, doesn't have a sell price, so it doesn't get included in GDP. The underground economy, once again, doesn't get included in the GDP. Environmental quality, that doesn't get counted in GDP. And, of course, leisure. All right, that is not included in GDP. Let me explain those in turn real quick. Okay, so non-market goods. Let's say that goods and services that are produced and make our life better, but they're not sold. I'm not talking about like the car that is not sold at the end of the year and gets sold the next year. I mean something that's never sold. What do you mean? I know what I mean. I mean uncompensated household activities. What about washing dishes? What about mowing lawns? What about cleaning, right? Every time that I make my family dinner or my wife watches our kids, that makes our life better. It increases our standard of living. It ought to make the GDP go up because the GDP is supposed to reflect our standard of living. But it doesn't because we didn't sell it on the market. I didn't sell my service of cooking. My wife didn't sell her childcare service on the market. So it doesn't get included in GDP. So GDP is smaller than it should be. It's missing that, okay? All right, another one. What about environmental quality? Which country would you like to live in more? Some country that had a real GDP of 10 million units of making something with nice air and clean energy, or one with the same amount of stuff but no environmental standards at all? You can think about that, right? They have equal GDP, but is well-being the same? I'd definitely rather live in country A. And even more paradoxically, and perversely actually, imagine you see all these beautiful trees. If we cut down every single one of these trees and sold it as lumber from the sawmill, that would make our GDP go up because we made more stuff, right? But the standard of living is not going up. We're cutting down all these beautiful trees. Our life is going to be worse, but our GDP at that same time is going to be going up, right? So this is a bit of a problem, and it's not taken care of in the GDP at all. All right, another issue is our underground economy. So by underground economy, what do I mean? I mean both the legal and the illegal pieces of the underground economy. There's legal underground economy? Yeah, there is stuff that people pay cash. We call it under the table often. What about waitress tips? What about babysitting? These things are just, money that I pay the neighbor kid to babysit. That doesn't go into the GDP, but that's a service provided, right? And it did make my life better, and it ought to make the GDP go up, but it doesn't because there's no way to record it. It just wasn't sold. And then, of course, there are illegal things done in the underground economy: narcotics, drugs, prostitution. These are things, hey, they're services. They might make people's life better, but they're definitely not included in the GDP because there's no way to record that money, right? So, I mean, how big is our underground economy? In the United States, we estimate that we're missing 10% of our GDP, okay? 10% of our GDP. In developing countries, though, there's a much larger underground economy. It could be as large as 45% in some countries. All right, another thing we're missing is the leisure time, trade-off between labor and leisure, right? If you look at the average work week, across the world, South Korea, 46 hours, Netherlands, 28 hours. What do you think the United States is? Right? Our average work week is actually 36 hours. That's right, the same as Japan. What if we could, Netherlands is considered one of the happiest countries in the world. Maybe it's because they don't work quite as much. Do you really need to work quite as much? Right? If you could have more time off, you really might be happier. That would make your standard of living go up, but it would not make the GDP go up. So the GDP doesn't capture that, right? So there's other things that we care about that's not in the GDP. You know what? I'll tell you what. If my life expectancy goes up, my standard of living, I consider myself having a better life, but GDP is not going to go up. What about education levels? What about access to healthcare? What about crime rates, right? All of these things definitely tend to make our life better, and I'm happier, and I wish that the GDP would go up when I got beneficial improvements in these numbers, but they don't because there's no way to include it in the GDP because none of that stuff actually gets sold on the market, all right? So in conclusion, in this chapter, we learned a measure of economic output called GDP. That's the market value of all final goods and services produced in a nation with a specific period of time. Remember that, right? Remember, it's the market value, there's final goods and services. And we use it to examine economic growth, right? We can look at change in the real GDP, and now you know how to calculate that using the percent change formula. We can use fluctuations in economic activity around the long-term trend. We call those business cycles. We can also compare countries, right? I'd probably be okay. The United States has a GDP per person of about 55,000. I'd probably feel real similar if I lived in another country with a GDP per capita of 55,000. If I went to a country with $1,000 per person GDP, I would probably not feel the same as living here, right? Okay, so don't forget, real GDP is adjusted for inflation, and most of the time what we're actually interested in is real GDP. So thank you very much for being part of Chapter 19 and learning about the GDP.